You know how everyone says pregnancy should be this magical time? Well, apparently nobody told my husband that. Because the second I shared our good news, he turned into some paranoid detective instead of celebrating with me. I'm Darla, I'm 29. And honestly, I thought I had this whole marriage thing figured out. Gabe and I have been together for 6 years. Married, stable jobs, cute little house with the white picket fence situation. I work in retail management, nothing glamorous, but it pays decent, and he does something with inventory systems that honestly I tune out when he talks about it. The point is, we're solid. Or we were until recently. So here's what happened. About 4 months ago, I got this random text from Andrew, my ex from college. Now, before you start judging, it was completely innocent. He just reached out saying, "Hey, how's life?" that kind of thing. And yes, I texted back because I'm not some cold bitch who ignores people. We had history, sure, but that was years ago. I'm married now. He knows I'm married. It's not like we were planning some secret rendezvous. But Gabe found out somehow. I still don't know how, because it's not like I was hiding anything major. Maybe he saw a notification or something. I honestly can't remember. The point is, he confronted me about it, and I told him the truth, that Andrew and I were just catching up. Old friends, you know? But Gabe got this weird look on his face and started asking all these questions like, when did he text? What did we talk about? Why didn't I mention it? I mean, seriously. Do I need to give him a play-by-play of every conversation I have? I've never given him reason not to trust me. Ever. I told him it was no big deal, that we were just being friendly, but he kept pushing. So I might have gotten a little defensive, because honestly, his paranoia was insulting. Like, I chose him, I married him, what more does he want? Things got tense for a while after that. Gabe started being weird, checking my phone when he thought I wasn't looking, asking where I was going when I ran errands, that controlling bullshit I hate. I started keeping my phone closer because his behavior was making me uncomfortable. A girl has a right to privacy, right? And yeah, maybe Andrew and I kept texting a bit here and there, but it was harmless. Just talking about old times, sharing funny memes, normal friend stuff. Then last month, I found out I was pregnant. I was so excited. We'd been trying for a while, and finally it happened. I thought this would fix everything between Gabe and me, bring us closer together. When I told him, his reaction was not what I expected. Instead of jumping up and down or crying happy tears, he just stared at me with this unreadable expression. Then he asked when I ovulated. When I ovulated, like I keep a fucking calendar or something. The whole moment felt ruined. Instead of celebrating our miracle, he was already doing math in his head, calculating dates like some forensic accountant. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just shocked or nervous about becoming a dad. But over the next few days, his behavior got even stranger. He'd catch me texting and get this suspicious look, even though half the time I was just responding to work emails or talking to my mom. He started asking these loaded questions about my cycle, about when we last had sex, about my conversations with Andrew. It was exhausting and honestly kind of gross that he was thinking about our sex life in terms of dates and timelines. I mean, what kind of husband immediately assumes his pregnant wife is lying to him? What kind of man's first instinct is doubt instead of joy? Between us, I wanted to scream at him that his paranoia was going to ruin what should have been the happiest time in our lives. The Andrew thing was becoming this massive issue for no reason. Yes, we'd been texting more frequently, but Gabe didn't know the context. Andrew was going through a rough breakup, and I was just being supportive. You know, like a decent human being. But when I tried to explain this to Gabe, he acted like I was speaking another language. "Why are you texting your ex when you're married to me?" he kept asking. And I kept explaining, because we're friends. Because I'm not going to be rude to someone who's reaching out for support. Because I'm a grown woman who can have conversations without my husband's permission. But Gabe couldn't seem to understand this basic concept. The worst part was how he started monitoring me. He'd casually ask who I was texting when my phone buzzed. He'd want to know where I was going and when I'd be back if I left the house. One time I caught him going through my purse, and when I confronted him, he had the nerve to say he was just looking for gum. Like I'm stupid. I started deleting some of my conversations with Andrew, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because Gabe's paranoia was making our house feel like a prison. A girl shouldn't have to hide innocent friendships just because her husband can't handle his own insecurity issues. But Gabe took my privacy as proof of guilt, which was completely backwards logic. Then came the night everything exploded. Gabe sat me down and said we needed to talk about the timeline. He'd apparently been calculating when the baby was conceived and when I'd been talking to Andrew most frequently. The fact that he'd been doing math on our relationship was so insulting I could barely speak. He presented his little theory like he was some prosecutor, asking if I could see why he might have concerns. I lost it. I told him his accusations were disgusting and hurtful, and that if he couldn't trust his own wife, maybe he wasn't ready to be a father. I might have gotten a little emotional, pregnancy hormones, but his response was to get even colder and more suspicious. Gabe's behavior got even worse after I announced the pregnancy. Instead of being excited about our baby, he started doing this thing where he'd stare at me like he was trying to solve some puzzle. He'd ask these loaded questions about my cycle, about when we last had sex, about my conversations with Andrew. It was exhausting and honestly kind of gross that he was thinking about our sex life in terms of dates and timelines. I tried to stay patient because I know pregnancy can make men weird too, but his suspicion was starting to really piss me off. Like, this should be the happiest time in our lives and he's acting like I'm some cheating whore. Every time I tried to talk to him about baby names or nursery colors, he'd get this distant look and change the subject. It was like he couldn't even pretend to be excited about our future child. The Andrew situation was becoming this massive weight on our relationship. Yes, we'd been texting more frequently, but Gabe didn't understand that Andrew needed support during his breakup. I was just being a good friend, the same way I'd want someone to be there for me if I was going through a hard time. But every time I tried to explain this to Gabe, he'd twist it into something sinister. Why are you more concerned about your ex's feelings than your husband's? He'd say. Which wasn't fair at all. I cared about both of them, just in different ways. One was my past, one was my present and future. But Gabe couldn't see the difference. The worst part was how he started treating me like I was guilty until proven innocent. He'd come home from work and immediately scan the room like he was looking for evidence of something. He'd check my phone location when I went grocery shopping. He started asking our neighbors if they'd seen any strange cars in our driveway. The whole thing was humiliating and completely over the top. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home, constantly having to justify my actions and explain my whereabouts. When I complained to my mom about Gabe's behavior, she said maybe I should just stop talking to Andrew to keep the peace. But why should I have to give up a friendship because my husband can't handle his own jealousy? Why should I be punished for his trust issues? I started keeping my conversations with Andrew more private, not because I was hiding anything scandalous, but because Gabe's reactions were becoming increasingly irrational. Every text notification would make him tense up. Every time I smiled at my phone, he'd ask what was so funny. It was like living with a suspicious detective instead of my loving husband. And the pregnancy should have been bringing us together. But instead, it was driving this wedge between us that seemed to get wider every day. One evening, Gabe found my phone unlocked on the counter while I was in the bathroom. When I came back, he was scrolling through my messages with Andrew, his jaw clenched tight. I couldn't believe he'd violated my privacy like that, going through my personal conversations without permission. When I confronted him about it, he said he had every right to know what his wife was discussing with her ex-boyfriend. The way he said ex-boyfriend, like it was some dirty word, made me realize just how far gone he was with this paranoia. I tried to explain that the messages were innocent, just friendly check-ins and support during Andrew's difficult time. But Gabe was fixated on the frequency and timing. He kept saying things like, "Why didn't you tell me you were talking to him this much? And what else aren't you telling me?" It was like he'd already decided I was guilty and was just looking for evidence to support his theory. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night. Gabe came home from work with this serious expression that I'd learned to dread. He sat me down at our kitchen table and said he'd been thinking a lot about our situation. The way he said situation, like our pregnancy was some kind of problem to solve, already had me on edge. Then he dropped the bomb. He wanted a paternity test. I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own husband, the man who's supposed to love and support me unconditionally, was essentially calling me a cheater to my face. The accusation was so absurd I actually laughed at first, thinking maybe he was joking. But Gabe just sat there with his arms crossed, completely serious. "I need to know for sure," he said. "Given everything that's happened with Andrew, I can't move forward without knowing." I tried to stay calm and reasonable. I explained that his request was incredibly hurtful and based on absolutely nothing. Yes, I'd been talking to Andrew, but talking isn't cheating. Yes, the timing might look suspicious to someone with trust issues, but correlation isn't causation. I reminded him that we'd been trying to get pregnant for months, that this baby was planned and wanted by both of us, but Gabe wouldn't let it go. He kept saying things like, "I want to believe you, and this would give us both peace of mind," which was complete bullshit. Peace of mind for who? Him? Because I already had peace of mind knowing exactly whose baby this was. His doubt was the problem, not my behavior. I told him that if he needed a paternity test to believe me, then we had bigger problems than he realized. What kind of marriage do you have if your husband assumes you're lying about something this important? What kind of father demands proof that his child is actually his child? That's when Gabe dropped the real ultimatum. He said if I wouldn't agree to the test, he'd leave. Just like that. After 6 years of marriage, after everything we'd built together, he was ready to walk away because of his own paranoid fantasies. He said he couldn't raise a child knowing he might not be the father, and that he deserved to know the truth. The selfishness of it blew my mind. Here I am, growing his child, dealing with morning sickness and hormones and all the shit that comes with pregnancy, and his main concern is whether he's been somehow tricked. Like I'm some master manipulator who got pregnant just to trap him with another man's baby. The whole thing was insane. I told him that if he'd pushed for this test, our marriage would be over. Because honestly, how do you come back from your husband basically calling you a liar and a cheater? How do you raise a child with someone who doesn't trust you? His response was to say that maybe our marriage was already over if I wouldn't prove my innocence. Innocence. Like I was on trial for some crime I didn't commit. Once word got out about our situation, and somehow it always gets out, everyone had an opinion. Gabe told his sister Nora first, which was strategic because she's always been cold toward me anyway. She immediately sided with him, saying he had every right to know and that I was being unreasonable by refusing. Easy for her to say when she's not the one being accused of cheating. My mom, Patricia, was horrified when I told her. She couldn't believe Gabe would demand such a thing, especially while I'm pregnant. In my day, she kept saying, husbands trusted their wives. But even she started asking weird questions about Andrew, like when exactly we'd been talking, and whether Gabe had reasons to be suspicious. The whole thing became this public spectacle that I never wanted. Gabe's family rallied around him like he was some victim, while my family tried to stay neutral, but clearly thought I should just take the test to keep the peace. Nobody seemed to care about how humiliating this whole thing was for me. At work, I had to deal with whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. My coworkers knew something was up. You can't hide that kind of stress when you're pregnant and your husband is barely speaking to you. A few of the girls asked if everything was okay at home, and what was I supposed to say? That my husband thinks I'm a cheating slut? That he's threatening divorce unless I prove our baby is his? Meanwhile, Gabe moved into the guest room to give us both space to think. Space to think about what, exactly? About whether I wanted to submit to his humiliating demand or stand up for my dignity? He'd come home from work, eat dinner in silence, and then disappear upstairs. When I tried to talk to him about anything baby-related, doctor's appointments, nursery planning, anything, he'd give me these one-word answers like he was doing me some huge favor by responding at all. The worst part was how everyone kept saying, this could all be resolved so easily. Just take the test, they'd say. If you have nothing to hide, what's the big deal? But they didn't understand that it wasn't about having something to hide. It was about the principle. It was about Gabe not trusting me. It was about him choosing doubt over faith in our marriage. And yes, Andrew and I were still texting during this time, but not about anything inappropriate. He was actually being really supportive about my pregnancy situation, which was more than I could say for my own husband. When I told Andrew what Gabe was demanding, he was shocked. He said any man who really loved his wife wouldn't put her through something so degrading. At least someone understood what I was going through. Gabe found out I was still talking to Andrew, probably because he was snooping through my phone like some stalker, and completely lost his shit. He said this proved I was still hiding things and made his demand for a paternity test even more reasonable. The circular logic made me want to scream. I was talking to Andrew because Gabe was being impossible, and Gabe was being impossible because I was talking to Andrew. Gabe gave me an ultimatum with a deadline: agree to the paternity test by Friday or he'd file for divorce. He said he'd already talked to a lawyer. When the hell did he do that? And that he wasn't bluffing about leaving. The cold way he delivered this news, like he was discussing the weather, showed me a side of him I'd never seen before. I spent that week going through every emotion possible. Rage that he'd put me in this position. Hurt that he trusted his paranoia more than his wife. Fear that he might actually leave me while I'm pregnant. And underneath it all, this growing panic that maybe I'd miscalculated something important. Because here's the thing. Nobody knew. Andrew and I hadn't just been texting. There was one night about 5 months ago when Gabe was out of town for work and I was feeling lonely and unappreciated. Andrew had been going through his breakup and we'd been talking about old times. And one thing led to another. It was supposed to be just comfort sex, a one-time thing that didn't mean anything. Just two people who knew each other well, helping each other through rough patches. I convinced myself it didn't matter because Gabe and I were still having regular sex, and I got pregnant shortly after he came back from his trip. The timing worked out perfectly for it to be Gabe's baby. Probably. Almost definitely. But there was this tiny sliver of doubt that I'd buried so deep I almost forgot about it. When Gabe scheduled the paternity test, I had no choice but to go through with it or lose everything. I told myself everything would be fine, that my instincts were right, and this baby was Gabe's. We'd do the stupid test, prove Gabe wrong, and maybe then he'd realize how badly he'd fucked up our relationship with his accusations. The test was humiliating. Sitting in that clinic while they swabbed my cheek and took Gabe's blood, answering the technician's questions about possible fathers, watching Gabe's face for any sign that he realized how awful this whole thing was. He didn't. He just sat there looking relieved that he was finally getting his answers. The results would take a week. The longest week of my life. When the call came, I answered while Gabe was at work. The nurse was professional, but I could hear something in her tone that made my stomach drop before she even spoke the words. The test showed that Gabe was not the biological father. I hung up and immediately called the clinic back, thinking there had to be some mistake. But they confirmed the results. According to their test, there was 0% probability that Gabe was the father of my baby. My hands were shaking as I tried to figure out what this meant. How was I going to tell Gabe? How was I going to explain this when I'd been so certain, so insistent that he was wrong to doubt me? I decided not to tell Gabe immediately. I needed time to think, to figure out how to spin this in a way that didn't make me look like the villain. Because honestly, one mistake doesn't erase 6 years of marriage. One night with Andrew doesn't negate everything Gabe and I built together. But Gabe came home that day acting different, more confident, almost cocky. He said the clinic had called him too with the results, and he wanted to discuss what happens next. The way he said it, like he was in control now, made me realize he already knew. I tried to explain that the test must be wrong, that these things aren't 100% accurate, that maybe we should get a second opinion. But Gabe just sat there with this satisfied expression, like he'd been proven right about everything. He said he'd already made appointments with lawyers and that I had until the end of the week to move out. Move out. Of my own house. Like I was some stranger he was evicting instead of his wife who's carrying a baby. I tried everything. I cried, I begged, I explained that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. I told him about that one night with Andrew, but framed it like it was emotional cheating that went too far, not planned or intentional. I said I was confused and scared, and that pregnancy had messed with my judgment. Gabe wouldn't budge. He said the lying was worse than the cheating, that if I'd been honest from the beginning, maybe we could have worked through it. But all I'd done was lie and gaslight him for months while he questioned his own sanity. He said he couldn't trust anything I said anymore. The divorce moved fast. Gabe had already consulted lawyers, already figured out how to protect himself financially, already planned his exit strategy. Meanwhile, I was scrambling to find an apartment and figure out how I was going to support myself and a baby on my retail salary. The worst part was watching how quickly everyone turned on me. Gabe's family acted like he was some hero for standing up for himself. My own family was disappointed in me, but tried to stay neutral. Even my friends seemed to think Gabe was justified, like discovering your pregnant wife had been texting her ex, somehow made demanding paternity tests normal behavior. 3 years later, I'm a single mom working 2 jobs while Gabe is engaged to some nurse he met at a community center. Everyone talks about how happy and healthy their relationship looks, how she appreciates him in ways I apparently never did. But honestly, I'm done feeling guilty about the whole thing. Gabe could have fought for our marriage instead of running straight to lawyers. He could have been more understanding about my friendship with Andrew instead of turning it into some conspiracy. And he definitely could have been more supportive during my pregnancy instead of making everything about his own insecurities. Do I regret that night with Andrew? Maybe. But I don't regret standing up to Gabe's controlling behavior. I don't regret refusing to be treated like a criminal in my own home. And I definitely don't regret that he showed me who he really was before I wasted more years trying to make him happy. Some people think I should have just taken the test from the beginning, but that's missing the point entirely. The point is that a real husband wouldn't have needed one. A real husband would have trusted his wife. A real husband would have worked through his doubts instead of threatening divorce. Gabe got what he wanted, his perfect little life with his perfect little girlfriend who probably never talks to any exes or makes him question anything. Good for him. But when that relationship inevitably fails, because he never learned how to trust anyone, don't say I didn't warn him.